Chapter 4 of Superwomen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Superwomen by Albert Payson Terhune. Chapter 4. Helen of Troy, Model for all the Sirens of the Centuries. Some wise folk say she never existed. But, for that matter, some wise folk also say that her press agent Homer never existed, and that his Iliad and Odyssey were compilations of lesser men's writings. As well say that Napoleon was a compilation of his marshals. Some aver that she indeed walked the earth, a wonder woman, and that her charm perhaps stirred up strife among nations, but that her fame kept on growing after she was dead, until, even as hundreds of jokes were attributed to Joe Miller that Joe never perpetrated or even heard, people got to making her the heroine of a myriad impossible deeds and adventures that no one woman or no 10 women could have achieved. Still others declare that she and her story were allegorical, standing for feminine charm and for its fatal power, that she embodied the Greek idea of superwoman perfection. The same sort of people gravely tell us that Hercules and Croesus and William Tell were solar myths, whatever that may mean, and their descendants will put the myth brand 10,000 years hence on Napoleon, Roosevelt, John L. Sullivan, and Lydia Pinkham. While common sense may balk at the tale of Helen of Troy, common sense would as readily balk at a narrative of the high cost of living or of the All-Europe War. And what is common sense among friends? I'm going to tell Helen's story as if it were gospel truth. For all I know, it may be. I am not going to draw on a dull imagination for any of it, but to take it entirely from a dozen of the olden authorities from Homer down. After all, since we believe in Santa Claus, why not in Helen of Troy? I cannot help feeling a little thrill of pride in this preamble. In spots it is almost scholarly, and so to the story. She was the daughter of Tyndareus of Argos, one of the horde of kinglets who split up the Greek archipelago among them. She lived 3,000 years ago, and so adorable was she that someone started a rumor that she was not the daughter of Tyndareus but of great Jove himself. This kind of talk passed as complimentary in those benighted days. Wherefore, Helen's parents did not start a suit for criminal libel against the flatterer, but heaped honors on him. By the time Helen reached young womanhood, she was the wonder of all Greece. She was tall, slender, and red-haired. In a day of almost universal dowdiness, she knew how to wear her clothes, although she did not use that knowledge to any prodigal extent, clothes in balmy prehistoric Greece being used for adornment rather than as coverings. Her wit and her subtle magnetism vied with her good looks. Suitors came from one end of the archipelago to the other to visit the palace of Tyndareus and to pay court to the wonder girl. They were a goodly throng, these suitors, kings one and all, even though most of their kingdoms were smaller than Delaware. Here are a few names culled from the endless list. Ulysses, craftiest of Greeks, a short-legged man with the upper body of a giant. Agamemnon, overlord of all Greece, titular king of Mycenae, a hot-tempered, long-winded potentate. Menelaus of Sparta, Agamemnon's brother, an honest, not over-bright, kind-hearted chap who loved sport better than statesmanship. Nestor, the wisest of men, yet old enough to have known better than to come a-courting, for already his hair and beard were white. The 2 Ajaxes, thick-heads both, one of whom was later to crown a silly life by defying Jove's lightning to mortal combat. Diomed, champion heavyweight battler of his century. Achilles, fiery demigod and prehistoric matinee hero, these and many another. Now, in that benighted age, Kings had a way of gratifying personal grudges by declaring war on their fellow sovereigns. Tyndareus was a shrewd old fellow. Also, he was fond of his glorious daughter, and he wanted to save her and her future husband from possible misfortune. So, before he allowed Helen to make her choice, he bound each and all of the suitors to the following solemn oath: that they would not only abide peacefully by Helen's decision, but would pledge themselves to fight to the death in behalf of the contest's winner if, at any future time, his domestic peace should be threatened, or his wife stolen from him. This pledge was not as fanciful as it may seem, for caveman tactics of wooing by capture were still more or less in vogue. A man who fell in love with another's wife was wont to kidnap her and to defy her bereft spouse to get her back. Thus, Tyndareus was not only preventing civil war in Greece, but he was making it prohibitively perilous for any outsider to try to win Helen. Such a wooer would find himself at odds with practically every country in the whole archipelago. Yes, decidedly, Tyndareus knew what he was about. He was assuring his daughter, as far as was humanly possible, a safe married life. All the royal suitors, being very much in love, were in a condition to promise anything. They bound themselves right willingly to the oath Tyndareus exacted. Even Nestor, who, as I think I said, was old and wise enough to have known better. It is a supreme tribute to Helen's glory that the wisest man alive should have behaved just as foolishly over her as did the osseous-brained Ajax Telamon. The oath being taken, Helen's choice was made known, and out of the ruck of greater and richer and handsomer men she chose the plodding Menelaus, king of Sparta. There were black looks, there were highly unstoical gusts of anger, but the disappointed suitors made the best of their bad luck. After consoling themselves by getting gloriously drunk at the marriage feast, they called it a day and went home, not one of them realizing how fearfully his lovelorn oath was one day to bind him. And the golden Helen departed for the prim little grim little kingdom of Sparta with her liege lord Menelaus. The years drifted on lazily, happily, in humdrum fashion. If Menelaus were not inspiring as a husband, he was at least pleasanter to live with than a cleverer man might have been. He and Helen had one child, a daughter, Hermione. Placid years make sweet living, but poor telling. So let us get along to the day when heralds from the port of Pylos brought news of a strange prince's arrival on the Spartan shores. The messengers knew not who the stranger might be, nor whence he came, but from his retinue and dress and bearing they judged him worthy to be a guest of honor. So a gorgeous guard was sent to escort him to the palace, and great preparations were made there to receive him. The event seems to warrant a more Homeric wealth of language than I can compass, but it would be hard not to drop into semi-stately, not to say semi-Homeric and wholly plagiaristic diction over it, so bear with me, it won't last long. Adown the dry white road that ran to Pylos through the plain, a dust cloud was advancing, shields of bronze and weapons gleaming through it, here and there, with glimpses of purple robes. In the palace, tables were set out with fair linen on them. Meats were brought forth, with rare wine from the Ismarian vineyards to the north. A votive heifer was driven in, lowing from the fields for the guest sacrifice. Her horns were soon sheathed with gold, then the axeman felled and killed her with a single blow. She was quartered, and her fat was laid on the fire, along with barley grain. And the savor of the sacrifice rose grateful to high Olympus. Now, through the yellow dust cloud, chariots were to be seen. A hardy band of mariners plodded beside the wheels and behind. They were bronzed and clear-eyed, these sea rovers, beguiling the journey with gay speech and with deep, mighty laughs, and they shouted instead of speaking as do land folk. In the foremost chariot rode two men. One was King Diocles of Pherae, the other was the goodliest man mortal eye ever looked upon. A mane of fine-spun golden hair fell over the shoulders of his Sidonian robe, his face was like the sunshine, and his eyes were filled with the gladness of living. He was Paris, son of King Priam and a prince of Troy, and his right hand gripped a shadow-casting spear. In the banquet hall, when the visitors and their host were seated, appeared Helen, the wife of Menelaus, with her little daughter Hermione. When the cries of hunger and of thirst had died down, Helen addressed the strangers, asking no direct question, since to question a guest were discourteous, but saying that mayhap they would deign to explain who they were, and why they had come hither. Then arose Paris, standing by the board, facing the golden Helen, and he spoke winged words. It was prophesied at his birth, he began, that he would one day be the ruin of Troy. To prevent his living to fulfill his ordained fate, his father, King Priam, weeping at the deed's black necessity, had him borne to the lonely top of Mount Ida, there to die of exposure or at the fangs of wild beasts. But a great she-bear, roaming the mountain crest, found the babe and brought him down to her cave, and there laid him among her own soft-coated young. Here he was found one day by herdsmen, among whom he grew up. In time he owned a herd. The best loved of his cattle was a white bull called the Star. Now, it came to pass that King Priam, urged on by a dream, sent his slaves to Mount Ida's slopes to secure the finest bull that grazed there for a sacrifice to Neptune. The slaves came upon the Star and drove him away with them. Paris gave chase, but in vain. Then he hastened to the city of Troy to beg redress from the king. And as he entered the outer gates of Priam's palace, his own sister Cassandra recognized him. Cassandra was a prophetess. Apollo had loved her, and, as a love gift, had endowed her with a gift of foretelling all things. But when she rejected his suit, he willed that, while she might still retain the gift of prophecy, her forecasts should never be believed. So now her words were laughed to scorn. But Priam questioned the mountaineer, and by the resemblance the youth bore to his father, and the ring that he still wore around his neck, where it had been placed when he had been taken up into the mountain as an infant, the king at last knew him. Great was his joy, and so, elevated to his rightful princely station, Paris passed the next few years no longer in the harsh toil and on the poor fare of a herder, but as a king's son. Wholly forgetting Oenone, the forest girl of Mount Ida whom he had wooed and won and deserted, and whom he today mentioned merely in the pride of a past conquest. Now, breaking in upon Paris's somewhat long-winded story of his life, let us come to the real reason of his presence in Sparta. The goddess of strife had tried to enliven things in peaceful Olympus by tossing down in front of Venus and Juno and Minerva a golden apple. On the apple's rind was graven the inscription, "For the most beautiful." Straightway the three goddesses, who had been tolerably good friends, fell to quarreling as to which should have the apple of gold, and they compromised by leaving the decision to Paris. Every member of the trio tried secretly to bribe him, Juno offering him power, Minerva offering him wisdom, Venus promising him love, the love of the fairest woman on earth. Being very young and very human, Paris chose love, casting aside all hope of power and of wisdom to gain it. And Venus bade him sail forth in search of the wonder woman she had promised him. He had departed on this quest of the golden girl, and fate had led him to Helen. I am not going to touch on the mythological part of Helen's career more than I can help, but I protest most solemnly that the foregoing tale of Paris and the three goddesses is not mythology, but absolute truth. It may never have happened, indeed, it could not have happened, but it is truth nonetheless. If you doubt that a silly apple could cause such strife among three erstwhile friendly deities, and stir up unending enmity and discord and hatred, just remember that the apple was of gold. Wait until the family estate is divided among the heirs who have hitherto been such good friends, and watch what the golden apple of discord can do to breed hate and dissensions. Those old Greeks were wise, even in their myths. They knew human nature, and human nature's sole change since their day is the substitution of conventionality for simplicity. At heart there is no difference. Take, too, Paris's choice of love rather than of wisdom or of power. When we read about that as children, we said smugly, "What a fool Paris was!" Then, as we grew older, well, if Paris was a fool, just note in what goodly company he stands. His compeers in the same divine idiocy are such immortals as Mark Antony, Marie Stuart, Francis I, almost the whole Bourbon dynasty, Sappho, Cleopatra, Solomon, and a sheaf of other shimmeringly splendid sinners. They were monomaniacs, all of them, and they sold their birthright of decency for a mess of ambrosia, too blinded to know or care how much they were losing, and for how barren a price. Wherein their particular brand of insanity gives them full right and privilege to claim kinship with the Gadarene swine of Holy Writ. Well, then, Paris had quested forth to find and win the most beautiful of women, and he found her at the banquet board of her spouse, Menelaus, king of Sparta. Long he abode, an honored and trusted guest in his host's palace, and Menelaus suspected nothing, not even that a man of godlike beauty and comfortable dearth of morals was a dangerous visitor in the home of a plodding, middle-aged husband. One night, while Menelaus snored peacefully in preparation for a boar hunt he had planned for the next day, Paris and Helen stole forth together in the darkness and sped hand in hand to Pylos, where the lovers' ship was in waiting. In his own arms Paris bore his inamorata from shore to deck. Away across the wine-hued Aegean fled the lovers, to Troy. There they were wed, regardless of the fact that Helen had left a perfectly good husband alive in Greece. The laws against bigamy, if there were any at that day, do not seem to have been very rigidly enforced, nor do those laws' fracturers appear to have lost caste thereby. Mind you, Helen was no lovesick girl to be swept off her feet by an impetuous wooer with spun-gold hair and a Romeo manner. When Paris stole her from Menelaus and married her, she was 40 years old. But, like Ninon de l'Enclos and Diane de Poictiers and other of the world's true superwomen, age had no power to mar her. Father Time could not pass a face like hers without pausing to kiss it, but the kiss was very tender and loving, and it left in its wake no wrinkles or telltale lines. Helen was ageless. Ilium worshipped beauty even as did Greece, and the Trojans, from old Priam down, hailed their new princess with rapture, all save Cassandra, that daughter of Priam, who was blessed by the gift of prophecy and cursed by the incredulity of all who heard her. At sight of Helen, Cassandra shrieked aloud, "Trojans, you nurse to your hearts a snake that shall sting you to death! You cherish a firebrand that shall burn our city to the dust." And she fell, writhing and foaming, at Helen's feet. But folk laughed at the forecast, and the cheers of welcome drowned the wail of the seeress. So did Argive Helen come to her husband's people, and thus did her beauty win all hearts. Paris adored her wildly, uncontrollably, to the hour of his death. Her passing infatuation for him soon cooled into contemptuous toleration, and for the second time in her life she learned that a husband is merely what is left of a lover after the nerve has been extracted. Meantime, Greece was humming like a kicked hornet's nest. Menelaus learned of his wife's flight, and with whom she had fled. He went, heartbroken, to his brother Agamemnon for help in avenging his wrongs. Agamemnon not only reminded him of the other suitors' promise to defend the honor of the man whom Helen should marry, but volunteered, as overlord of Greece, to force them to keep their vows. Now, this offer was none too easy to carry out. It is one thing to make the maddest pledge, under the drunkenness of love. It is quite another thing to fulfill that pledge when love is dead. The swain who at 20 declares to a girl, "If ever you want me, say the word, and I swear I will come to you from the ends of the earth," would be horribly embarrassed if, as a sedate husband and father at 40, that same half-forgotten sweetheart should hold him to his calf-love oath. So it was with Helen's suitors emeritus. Long ago they had loved her. She had married someone else, and during the past 20 years other interests in their lives had crowded out her memory. If they thought of her at all, it was now and then to court domestic tempests by mentally or verbally comparing her golden loveliness and eternal youth with their own wives' dumpy or slat-like matronly aspect. For they had wives, most of them, by this time, wives and children. Just stop for an instant, husbands all, and figure to yourselves what would happen if you should come home tomorrow night and break to your wives the tidings that you were about to go to war for the sake of another woman, a woman, moreover, whom you had once adored, and whose memory had ever stood, wistful, winsome, wrath-like, between your wives and you. So when Agamemnon's fiat went forth that those long-dead promises were to be redeemed at once, there were home scenes throughout Greece whose bare recital would forever have crushed the spirit of Mormonism. War must have seemed almost a relief to some of those luckless husbands after they had finished listening to their wives' remarks on the subject. For of all overdue debts in this world of varied indebtedness, the hardest by a millionfold to pay are the sight drafts of defunct sentiment. These olden heroes were not especially heroic in the crisis that threatened them, and none but a single man will be unduly harsh with them for their reluctance. One after another they sought to dodge the fulfillment of their pledges. Ulysses, for example, after an interview with his embarrassingly faithful wife Penelope (she has always reminded me of Mrs. Micawber), harnessed oxen to a plough and proceeded to give the impression that he had suddenly gone crazy by ploughing furrows in the salt sands of the seashore. Those whose minds had fled were supposed to be directly under divine protection, and naturally such people were never called upon to fight or to meet any other obligation. Truly, Ulysses was living up to his reputation as the craftiest of the Greeks. Yet his craft was put to naught by the wisdom of old Nestor, one of the few suitors who had not tried to crawl out of his agreement. Nestor placed Ulysses' baby son, Telemachus, on the seashore in the path of the advancing oxen. Ulysses turned the beasts aside to keep them from trampling the child to death, whereat it was decided that Ulysses was not insane, at least not too insane to do his share of fighting, and he was enrolled as one of the chiefs of the Grecian host. Having been caught, Ulysses set out morbidly to get even with destiny by catching others, and he, as well as Nestor, began to strip away the subterfuges of the reluctant kings. Achilles, for instance, tried to escape military service by dressing as a girl and hiding among the women of his household. Ulysses, disguised as a peddler, visited these women carrying a basket full of feminine gewgaws. At the bottom of the basket lay a magnificent sword. While the women were examining the jewelry and clothing in the peddler's stock, Achilles caught sight of the sword. For the first time he showed interest in the intruder's visit. Paying no heed to the rest of the wares, he picked up the sword and fell to examining it with a professional interest. At once Ulysses recognized him not only as a man, but as a warrior, and the sulky Achilles was forced to join the expedition. Day and night, throughout Greece, the smiths' hammers clinked and the smithy fires roared. Weapons were forged, armor was repaired, army equipments were set to rights. The woods and hilltops re-echoed to axe blows, as great trees were felled for ship timber. At last 1,200 ships lay at anchor, waiting to bear the avenging host to Troy. All this preparation was a matter of many months, and for a long time no hint of it reached Troy. Then, first in vague rumor, and soon in form not to be doubted, came news of the Greeks' preparation for war. By this time Helen had ceased to be a novelty in Troy, and now men cursed her beneath their breath as a sorceress who was to bring war and destruction upon them. Women hated her as the cause of their men's possible death in battle. But Priam and the noblest blessed of his sons, Hector, were still her stanch champions, and with such backing her position in the city was at least outwardly assured. Then came a minor tragedy, a foreshadowing of the wholesale misfortunes that were to follow. I have said that when Paris was still a herdsman on Mount Ida, he had met and loved a forest maid, Oenone, and on learning that he was a prince, he had promptly deserted her, leaving her to grief and loneliness. Oenone had borne Paris a son, although this was unknown to him. In the years since she had last seen the fickle prince, this son had grown up. He was known as Corythus. When word reached Oenone of Helen's arrival in Troy, she sent her unfortunate rival a message. She wrote the message on birch bark and dispatched it by Corythus to the city. Corythus arrived at the palace and was led to Helen's bower, where he begged the princess to dismiss her maids, as he was the bearer of a word for her ears alone. Helen, obeying, received from him the folded birch bark and opened it. She read, "O thou that dost scan these lines, hast thou forgotten quite thine ancient sin, thy palace, thy husband and child, even as Paris hath forgotten me? Thou shalt not forget, for I send thee my curse, with which I shall scourge thee till I die. Soon Paris must look into the eyes of death, and little in that hour will he care for thy sweet lips, thy singing voice, thine arms of ivory, thy gold-red hair. Nay, remembering that thou hast cost his life, he will bid the folk that hate thee have their joy, and give thee to the mountain beasts to tear or burn thy body on a tower of Troy. My son, and his, beareth this word to thee." As she finished reading, Helen fell in a swoon at Corythus's feet. The youth was alarmed and dropped on his knees beside her, lifting her head, and at that moment Paris entered the room. Seeing a stranger kneeling beside Helen, he went wild with jealous rage. Whipping out his sword, he sprang upon Corythus and buried the blade in the lad's neck. Then he turned to plunge the weapon into Helen's breast, but As he turned, he saw the birch-bark message on the floor and stooped to pick it up. Reading it, he realized what he had done and whom, in his jealous frenzy, he had killed. He flung himself, wailing, forth from the palace and into the night. 3 days later, Corythus was laid on his funeral pyre in the marketplace of Troy. As Paris was advancing with the lighted torch, Oenone appeared. She leaped upon the pyre and shrieked down at her recreant lover. "I hear the prayer that thou some day shalt make in vain. Thou shalt die and leave thy love behind thee for another, and little shall she love thy memory. But," turning upon the onlookers, "O ye foolish people, see! What death is coming on you from across the waters?" At the shrieked words, all turned and looked seaward. Bearing down on the coast in a driving rain, oar-blades flashing, sails straining at their rigging, came the long-dreaded Greek fleet. The Trojan War had begun. For a highly sporting and poetical and altogether deathless account of that contest, I commend you to Homer's Iliad. This is the story of Argive Helen, not an uncensored bulletin from the trenches. For 10 years the conflict waged, with varying fortunes. Again and again, as the tide of battle rolled up to the city's very walls, Helen stood on the ramparts and watched her former husband and the other men who had sworn eternal love for her, fighting and dying for her worthless sake. Once, as she stood thus, she found at her side the group of aged men who were Priam's counselors. Gray-bearded they were, and feeble, and long past the time when love can set the pulse a-flutter, and they hated Helen with a mighty loathing for the disaster she had brought upon their dear fatherland. Even now they had come forth upon the ramparts to berate her with her sin. Helen turned and faced them. The afternoon sun poured down upon her white-clad form and upon her wonder face with its crown of ruddy hair, and at sight of her these ancient moralists forgot why they had come hither. With one voice cried they aloud that the love of so glorious a woman were well worth the loss of Troy, ay, of all the world. 100 commentators have said that this tribute of the graybeards is the most supreme compliment ever paid to mortal woman's charms. Paris was at last challenged by Menelaus to mortal combat. He accepted the challenge, but later fled in terror from the man he had wronged. Soon afterward he led a sortie one night against the Greeks. A man on the outskirts of the Grecian camp gave the alarm and let fly an arrow at the advancing Trojans. The shaft struck Paris, inflicting a mortal wound. The dying man was borne back into the city and to the palace, where the thoroughly disillusioned Helen awaited him. Since his cowardice in fleeing from Menelaus, she had taken no pains to hide her contempt for him. Now, as he lay dying, she looked down without emotion on the sharer of her crime. And Paris, seeing her bend over him, spoke the pitiful farewell that Andrew Lang's verse has made sublime, and that even in mere prose cannot lose all its beauty. His voice weak, his eyes glazing, he said, "Long ago, dear, we were glad, we who never more shall be together. Will you kiss me once? It is 10 weary years since you have smiled on me. But, Helen, say farewell with your old smile." Helen, something of her dead tenderness coming back to her, kissed him, and with her kiss his life went out. The torch was set to the unlucky prince's pyre. From the crowd around it sprang Oenone. She mounted the blazing pile of wood, and her body was consumed with that of the man who was not worth dying for. Helen almost at once married Paris's younger brother, Deiphobus. One morning the Trojans awoke to find that all the Greeks had sailed away. Their huts stood abandoned on the beach. Their ships were nowhere visible on the horizon. Coming back, rejoicing, to the city, the scouting party that brought this joyous news found a monstrous wooden horse. They thought that the Greeks had built it and left it there to propitiate Neptune for a speedy and safe voyage back to their native shores. The Trojans bore the horse within the city's walls to keep it as a memento of the great war. Helen, passing near the wooden beast that night, heard within it the clank of arms. She halted, and in a low voice spoke the names of some of her old suitors. Ulysses answered, bidding her open a concealed trap-door in the horse's side. She obeyed. Out climbed a score of Greeks. Guided by Helen, they unbarred the city gates to the horde outside who had returned in their vessels. One of the greatest massacres of the ages followed. Babies were butchered as they slept. Women were cut down as they ran from their beds. Half-wakened men were slaughtered like sheep. Then the torch was applied, and all Troy was burned to ashes. Helen was saved from death by Ulysses, who took her to Menelaus and demanded kindly treatment for her, pleading in her behalf that she had at the last betrayed the Trojans by setting free the Greeks within the wooden horse. There was no need for his mediation. No man could harbor wrath against the golden Helen. Menelaus, at the very first meeting of their eyes, forgave and forgot. He opened his arms and his heart to the woman who had wrecked his life and who had brought to death thousands of gallant men. Back to Greece he bore her, back to Sparta, where he installed her once more as his queen. He had first brought her hither in triumph as a mere slip of a girl, to people who had received her with pride. Now she came to Sparta again, a woman of over 50, to a populace who cursed and reviled her. Widowed wives and weeping mothers spat at her as she passed them on the way to the palace. But none of this was as hard to bear as had been Agamemnon's parting words, spoken in her presence, to the Greek army on the shores of Ilium. Though his brother was minded to forgive, Agamemnon was not, and to the assembled host he had shouted, "O ye who overlong have borne the yoke, behold this woman, the very fountain of your sorrows. For her ye left your dear homes long ago, but now the black ships rot from stern to prow, and who knows if ye shall see your own again? Ay, and if homes ye win, ye yet may find, ye that the winds waft and the waters bear, that you are quite gone out of mind. Your fathers, dear and old, died dishonored there. Your children deem ye dead, and will not share their lands with you. On mainland or on isle, strange men are wooing now the women you wedded, for love doth lightly beguile a woman's heart. These sorrows hath Helen brought on you, so fall upon her straightway that she die, and clothe her beauty in a cloak of stone." The crowd had armed itself with stones as Agamemnon began to speak, but as he denounced her, they were looking at her upturned face, and from their nerveless hands the stones fell to earth. They found her too beautiful for death. Agamemnon, looking at her, cried, "Hath no man, then, avenged his wrongs by slaying thee? Is there none to shed thy blood for all that thou hast slain? To wreak on thee the wrongs that thou hast wrought? Nay, as mine own soul liveth, there is one. Before a ship takes sail, I will slay thee with mine own hand." But as he advanced toward her, sword in hand, her beauty seized him in its spell. He paused, irresolute, then turned away. For many years thereafter, Helen and Menelaus dwelt together at Sparta. And because the years were happy, both history and fable are silent about them, save that Menelaus was once more as slavishly enamored of his wife as in their first months together. Helen, too, was well content with this safe haven after her tempest-tossed decade, peace after war, port after stormy seas, rest after toil. The hatred of the people at large did not much distress her. Through the latticed windows of the palace filtered the growls of the populace, droning and futile as the roar of distant breakers. And even as breakers have no peril for landsmen, so, safe in her husband's home, Helen did not fear the grumbles of the folk he ruled. Then, in the fullness of his age, Menelaus died, and all at once the situation changed. Helen was no longer safe ashore, listening to the breakers. She was in their power. Her husband's protecting influence gone, she was at the mercy of his subjects, at the mercy of the merciless. The women of Sparta banded together, and in dangerous silence advanced upon the palace. These were the mothers, the wives, the daughters, the sweethearts of men who had left their white bones on the Trojan sea-coast, that the golden Helen might again rest snug in the shelter of Menelaus's love. There was not a doubt as to the militants' purpose, and as they drew near the palace, Helen fled. One or two slaves, still faithful to her, smuggled the fugitive out through a rear gateway and through the forests toward the seashore. There a handful of silver bought a fisher's boat and the service of his crew. And once more across the wine-hued Aegean fared the golden Helen, not this time in girlish light-heartedness to her husband's home, or in guilty happiness fleeing from that house by night with the man who had bewitched her, but a fugitive, scourged forth from the only home she knew. Storm-driven, her boat at last was blown ashore on the island of Rhodes. There she found she had been running toward ill fortune just as rapidly as she had thought she was running away from it. The Queen of Rhodes had lost a husband in the Trojan War, and, like every other woman on earth, she had sworn the vengeance oath against Helen. So the story goes, when the fugitive was brought before the Rhodian queen, the latter gave a single curt order. In obedience to that fierce command, Helen was led forth and hanged, her executioners being blindfolded that they might not balk at destroying the world's loveliest creation. So perished the golden Helen. For her sin she is known to fame as Helen of Troy, not Helen of Sparta, or even Helen of Argos. Posterity has branded her thus with the name of the land she destroyed, instead of the land of her birth. Poets and dreamers of dreams, even in her own century, have said that Helen did not die, that loveliness such as hers could not be destroyed, any more than can the smile of the springtide or the laughter of the sea. They say she escaped the Rhodians and set sail once more upon her wanderings. From shore to shore she voyaged, ageless, divine, immortal, as eternal as love itself. Ever, where she went, men adored her, and besought her to remain among them to bless or curse their lives. But, ever, women banded together to drive her forth again upon her endless wanderings. One legend tells of her sojourn in Egypt, and of her meeting there Ulysses, sacker of cities. Penelope was dead, and Ulysses had recommenced his voyaging. He and Helen met, and the old, old love of nearly a half-century earlier flared into new flame. And, as ever, Helen's love brought death in its wake, for the sacker of cities fell in battle within a few weeks after their reunion. Another and more popular legend is that Helen, in return for everlasting youth, formed a highly discreditable business partnership with Satan, whereby she was to serve as his lure for the damning of men's souls. Do you recall in Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, it was by promise of Helen's love that the devil won Faustus over to his bargain? There is a world of stark adoration in Faustus's greeting cry, as, for the first time, he beholds the enchantress. Is this the face that launched 1,000 ships and burned the topless towers of Ilium? Sweet Helen, make me immortal with a kiss. She granted him the kiss, but no immortality. Instead, his meed was damnation, like that of her million other swains. Goethe, in the second part of his Faust, makes her Marguerite's successor in Faust's love, and one poet after another has amplified the theory that she lives on through the ages, drawing men's souls from them. And the poets are often right, where sane folk are wrong. The Golden Helen, typifying the blind, all-engulfing love that laughs alike at reason and at destruction, lives and shall live while men are men. She lived as Cleopatra, for whom Antony deemed the world well lost. She lives as the hideously coiffured shop-girl with the debutante slouch and the blue-white powdered nose, for whom a $10-a-week clerk robs the till and goes to jail. And, as in the earliest days of her mortal wanderings, men ever stretch forth their arms to her as she passes, and beseech her to stay her flight long enough to let them damn themselves for her. And, as in those early days, women ever band together in righteous wrath to drive her forth into the darkness. Poor Helen! Or is it happy Helen? I think the former adjective is to be chosen, for the game she plays can end only in ultimate loss to herself, and that game's true winners in the long run are the very women who, fearing her spell over their loved ones, harry her forth to new wanderings. This thought should comfort them in the inevitable hour when Golden Helen's shadow shall fall momentarily athwart their placid lives. The prim path must inevitably triumph over the primrose path. End of Chapter 4. Recording by Linda Johnson. Chapter 5 of Superwomen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Superwomen by Albert Payson Terhune. Chapter 5. Madame Jumel, New York's first official heartbreaker. Far to the north, on New York City's westerly side, on 160th Street near St. Nicholas Avenue, stands almost the sole American memorial to a superwoman. It takes the shape of a colonial dwelling, 2½ stories high, white, crowned by a railed gazebo, and with rear extensions and columns and the rest of the architectural fantasies wherein our New World ancestors rejoiced. It is called the Jumel Mansion, after Madame Jumel, although it originally belonged to Mary Morris, an earlier and more beautiful manslayer, at whose dainty feet George Washington, with solemn but futile protestations, deposited his heart, and although the woman whose name it bears ended her days there, not as Madame Jumel, but as Mrs. Burr. The house once stood far in the silent country, but the thin, throbbing island's life crawled northward inch by inch, until today the mansion crouches, miscast and bewildered, amid a forest of new and top-heavy flat houses, happy hunting ground for none too rich home-seekers, and is shaken by the jar of L and New York Central trains. Poor old house! Bewigged and small-clothed great-grand'ther Peregrine from Pompton caught in the screaming eddy of a subway rush-hour crowd at the Grand Central. So much for rhapsody. The Jumel place is worth it, for there ghosts walk, the stately, lavender-scented old villains and villainettes who made up New York's smart set a century and a quarter ago, when flats were called rookeries, and polite folk would scarce mention such things. In those days, when any theme was too darkly disreputable or indelicate for discussion, and a few things still were, in that anti-white slave era, people were prone to refer to such doubtful topics as shrouded in mystery, and to let it go at that. There was more than one event in the cradle-to-grave career of Madame Jumel that called for and received the kindly mystery shroud. As far as coherence will allow, let us leave the shroud snugly tucked around those events. I mention it at the outset only because more than one chronicler has used it to account for hiati, or is it hiatuses? The former sounds more cultured somehow, in the lady's career. Whereas nearly all, if not quite all, these gaps can be bridged quite easily by well-authenticated facts, some of them too well authenticated for complete comfort. And so to the story. Aboard a ship bound north from the West Indies, one day in 1769, a woman died, a few hours after the birth of her baby daughter. It was not necessary to remove any wedding ring from the dead mother's finger before burying her at sea. One story says that her orphaned daughter's father had been a French sailor named Capet. Another, and wholly diverse tale, says that the baby was not born at sea at all, but in the Providence, Rhode Island poorhouse, and of unknown parentage. You see the shroud of mystery was pressed into service very early in the biography. In any event, soon after the ship touched at Providence, a Rhode Island tradesman's wife was so attracted by the prettiness of the solitary girl baby as to adopt her. At the subsequent christening, the rather uninspiring name of Eliza Bowen was bestowed on the child. No one seems to know why. More mystery, and not a particularly thrilling one at that. In straight-laced ways and to all demure modesty, Eliza was reared. And at 15 she was not only the prettiest girl in Rhode Island, but one of the cleverest, and, so declared the pious, one of the very worst. In those days, and in New England, it was delightfully easy to acquire a reputation for wickedness by merely failing to conform to all the ideas of the Blue Law devotees. Shan't we give Betty Bowen, her commonly used name, the benefit of the doubt? We know she was not only blessed with unwonted beauty, but with an exceptional mind. She had, in full measure, even in girlhood, the nameless and irresistible charm of the Superwoman. She was reckless, high of spirit, impatient of restraint, inclined to listen over kindly, perhaps, to the pleadings of her countless rural admirers. Then, when she was only 17, Colonel Peter Croix came into her life. Croix was a former officer in the British Army and lived in New York. He had plenty of money, and was more or less what, a century later, would have been called a rounder. How this middle-aged Lothario chanced to meet the Rhode Island belle, no one knows, but meet her he did. He was the first man of the world who had come into Betty's rustic life. By contrast with the local swains, he was irresistible, or so she found him. At all events, she did not resist. She eloped with him, and Rhode Island knew her no more. Her real career as a heartbreaker had set in. To New York, Colonel Croix brought his inamorata. There he installed her in a stately country house at 34th Street and Fifth Avenue, on the spot where afterward A.T. Stewart's white marble domicile used to excite the out-of-towners' awe, and where now a trust company's building stands. Betty wore amazingly costly clothes, paying for a single dress far more than for her year's wardrobe in Rhode Island. Croy festooned jewelry, Christmas tree-like, over her neck, hair, and hands. She blossomed like the rose. Croy, inordinately proud of his conquest, also brought shoals of his friends to call, which was a mistake, for Betty had no leanings toward monopolies. Like the hackneyed but ever useful meteor, Betty flashed upon stark young 18th-century New York. The city, so far as its male population was concerned, threw up both hands in blissful surrender. Croy's friends, some of them rounders like himself, some of them fat, solid, but beauty-loving financiers, formed a court of beauty around the fair newcomer. Betty's consummate charm drew to this court other and loftier men, too. For example, one of her foremost adorers was a brilliant, magnetic young statesman, whose birth was perhaps as unblessed as her own, but whose self-made name was already beginning to ring through America. He was Alexander Hamilton. He had a high-born and attractive wife of his own, and an adoring nestful of children. But Hamilton believed in monopolies no more than did Betty, and he became her adorer. Another of the higher type of men who came a-courting Betty was a statesman of almost equal fame, a little fellow, scarce 5 feet 4 inches tall and slight of build, whose strikingly handsome face was lighted by enormous black eyes, almost snake-like in their mesmeric power, particularly over women. He was Aaron Burr. Burr was a lady-killer of the first order. He was not a man of bad morals, he was simply a man of no morals at all. But he was also a man of no fear, and a genius withal. He knelt not in submission, but in ironic admiration before Betty. And she, like 50 other women, was swayed by his hypnotic eyes and his wondrous love eloquence. At the house of which Croy had made Betty the chatelaine, Burr and Hamilton often met, but never at the wish of either, for they hated every bone in each other's bodies. They had been at loggerheads as mere lads, when together they had served on General Washington's staff during the Revolutionary War. Afterward, in social and political life, they had clashed and clashed fiercely. Now, as rivals for the interest of the volatile Betty, their smoldering hate flamed forth lurid and deathless. And thenceforth, fanned by new political and other causes, that death-hate grew. It came to a head 7 years later, when in the gray of a chilly morning the lifelong rivals faced each other, pistol in hand, in the fields beyond Weehawken Heights, and when, at the first volley, Hamilton sprang high in the air, then crashed to the earth, mortally wounded. Yes, in her time, Betty had, directly or indirectly, much to answer for. George Washington Bowen, in after years, swore that he was the son of Betty and of the father of his country. This the Jumels have fiercely denied. Among the businessmen guests Croy brought to see Betty was an enormously rich old French wine merchant, Stephen Jumel by name. This was in 1804, the year of Hamilton's death. Jumel was 50. Betty was 35. Jumel was passing rich. Betty had shrewdness enough to realize that her own fortunes, under her present circumstances, depended solely on her looks and her charm. As beauty is not eternal, and as charm sometimes fails to outlive it, the Superwoman deemed it wise to accept the infatuated wine merchant's offer of marriage. Indeed, she is said to have angled with Napoleonic strategy for that same offer, and to have won it only after a sharp struggle of wits. Jumel was no fit opponent for her, then or ever after. From the first they appear to have had but a single will between them, and that was hers. On April 17, 1804, Betty and Jumel were married in St. Peter's Church in Berkeley Street. The wedding's record still stands in the parish archives. So does the statement made on that occasion by Betty, a statement charmingly at variance with all other records of her origin. For in the church register she wrote that she was born in 1777 and was the daughter of Phoebe and John Bowen, the latter a drowned sea captain. New York, having a somewhat tenacious memory, eyed the bride askance, or so she fancied, and, like many a later American, she sought to cover any possible reputation scars by a European veneer. She persuaded her husband to sell out some of his New York interest and to take her to Paris to live, which, ever obedient, he did. Napoleon I was at the heyday of his glory. About him was a court circle that did not look over closely into people's antecedents. Napoleon's brother-in-law, Murat, had started life as a tavern waiter. Napoleon himself was the son of a poor Corsican lawyer, and had never been able to learn to speak French without a barbarous accent. As for his sister Pauline, if a virtuous woman is a crown to her husband, Pauline's spouse, Prince Borghese, had not a ghost of a chance of skipping into the King Row. Nor was Napoleon's first wife, Josephine, of flawless repute. Altogether, it was a coterie unlikely to ask many questions about Betty's early history. The fascinations of Madame Jumel and the vast wealth of Monsieur Jumel were not to be withstood. Speedily the husband and wife were in the turgid center of things, part and parcel of imperial court life. As Betty had charmed level-headed New York, there is no need to describe in windy detail what she did to Paris. Her conquests there, like the stars of the Milky Way, shine indistinct and blurred because of their sheer numbers. But through the silvery blur gleams forth the name of Lafayette. The old Marquis was delighted at sight with the lovely young American, and he eagerly offered to act as her sponsor at court, which he did to the amusement of many and to the indefinite advancement of Betty's social hopes. The great Napoleon glanced in no slightest disfavor on Lafayette's social protégé. He willingly set the seal of imperial approval on the court's verdict. The emperor was Stephen Jumel's idol. Himself a self-made man, the old merchant worshipped this self-made demigod, the model and unattainable example of every self-making man since his day. Jumel's hero worship took a practical form. He placed his resources at the emperor's service, and once tactlessly but generously offered his own wealth and his New York home as solace and refuge in the increasingly probable event of the emperor's mislaying his crown. To which Napoleon replied, speaking as ever to the gallery: "Whatever reverses fortune may inflict on me, duty will chain me to France. It would be unworthy my greatness and an insult to my empire for me to seek asylum across the seas." Yet, when the inevitable day dawned, the fugitive emperor made plans to do that very thing, and Jumel met him more than halfway by crossing from New York to Havre on his own yacht, the Elizabeth, named for his wife, and seeking to bear away his fallen idol to safety. The plan, of course, fell through, and Napoleon, in consequence, was almost the only Bonaparte who did not sooner or later come to New York. Imperial friendship and a gloriously extravagant and extravagantly glorious wife are things to brag of. They are splendid advertisements. But they are not on the free list. In fact, they rip hideous breaches in the solidest wall of wealth. They played havoc with Papa Jumel's supposedly boundless fortune. One morning in Paris, the Jumels awoke to find themselves nastily close to bankruptcy. The French court was emphatically no fitting place wherein to go bankrupt. The scared Jumels realized this. Back they scurried to New York. in that born of fast-made and faster-lost fortunes to face what the future might bring. And now all praise to Betty Jumel, erstwhile queen of money-wasters. Instead of repining, or blaming her husband for letting her break him, or flitting to some wooer whose wealth was still intact, she did the very last thing her past would have led anyone to expect. She became, in effect, her husband's business partner. She displayed a genius for finance. It must have been stark genius, for her personal experience in the credit side of the money ledger was nil. More through his wife's aid than through his own sound business acumen, Papa Jumel began to win back the ground Betty had so industriously helped him to lose. One daring and lucky venture followed another. In an incredibly short time, the Jumels were again numbered among the very richest people in America. Once more, Betty launched on a career of luxury, but now and ever after she kept just within her abundant resources. Bankruptcy was a peril forever banished. Betty, you see, did not belong to the type of fool who runs his head twice into the same hornet's nest. There really was no need for such monotony. There were plenty of hornets' nests. The first expenditure to celebrate the new fortune was the buying of the big white house far away on the hillock above the Harlem River, a long, long coach drive up the Broadway from the city's fashionable residence district to the south of Duane Street. Remember, this was a full 20 years before the Southern merchant made his historic speech, "When I come to New York on business, I never think of stopping at the Astor House. It's much too far uptown for a busy man." The house Betty made her husband buy had been built years earlier by Colonel Roger Morris, after he married Mary Phillips, the colonial belle, whose father owned most of Westchester County and lived in a manor house there among his vassals like a feudal lord. To this abode moved the Jumels. Thither they brought a retinue of servants whose numbers amazed the thrifty New Yorkers. Here, too, were deposited such furniture as New York had seldom seen: a marvelously hideous marble-top table given to Papa Jumel by the Sultan of Turkey, a set of chairs that had been Napoleon's, a truly gaudy and cumbrous gold clock, which had been one of the emperor's gifts to Betty, tapestry and pictures that had once belonged to the Empress Josephine, dining-room furniture that had graced the salle à manger of King Charles X of France, a massive, glittering chandelier, the gift of General Moreau, who had vied with the emperor for Betty's smiles. Above all these and the rest of her home's rich furnishings, Betty treasured two other gifts from Napoleon. Odd gage d'amour for such a man to have given such a woman. They were the battered army chest and army cot used by him throughout the wonderful Italian campaign that had first established his fame. The world was scoured by Jumel's merchant ships to secure rare plants and trees for the 150-acre park surrounding the mansion. Cedars from Mount Lebanon, cypresses from Greece, exotic flowers from South America, roses from Provence. These were but a few of the innumerable exotics that filled the grounds. The park today is a wilderness of dingy, apartment-lined streets. Once established in their new home, the Jumels began to entertain on a scale that dwarfed even the much-vaunted hospitality of the antebellum South, and the people who, of yore, had looked obliquely and frostily on Betty Bowen now clamored and schemed and besought for invitations to her dinners. Well they might, for not only America's great folk delighted to honor the mansion by their presence, but every titled foreigner who touched our shores became a guest there. Hither came Joseph Bonaparte, kicked off the ready-made throne to which his emperor brother had vainly sought to fit the incompetent meager form and more meager intellect, and here he was entertained with royal honor, as if he had been still a sovereign instead of merely a crownless puppet no longer upheld by the mightiest of human hands. Here he was "Your Majesty," and people backed out of the room in which he chanced to be, stood until he gave them gracious leave to sit, and otherwise showered upon him the adoring servility that the freeborn are prone to lavish upon the representatives of monarchy. Bonaparte after Bonaparte visited the Jumels. The name Bonaparte was still one wherewith to conjure, and that fact by itself made its thick-headed and impecunious bearers welcome in almost every land they might choose to visit. They graciously accepted the Jumel house's hospitality and the veneration of their fellow guests. Still more graciously they borrowed money, which they never returned, of Papa Jumel. And, most graciously of all, they made ardent and heavy love to Betty. To the Jumel mansion came finally the last and least esteemed of the Bonaparte visitor, a squat, puffy-eyed princeling, pallid, crafty shadow of the Austerlitz man who had left France and jail one jump ahead of the police, had served as special constable in London to pick up enough money for food, and now, for similar reason, was teaching school in Bordentown, New Jersey. He was Louis Napoleon, alleged nephew of Napoleon I. I say alleged on the authority of Victor Hugo's famous sneer that Louis was neither the nephew of his uncle, the son of his father, nor the father of his son. It was Hugo, too, who, when Louis became Emperor of the French, under the title of Napoleon III, dubbed him Napoleon the Little, for which witticism Monsieur Hugo was promptly banished from France. Louis was the son of Napoleon's younger brother of the same name and of his wife and step-niece, Hortense Beauharnais. The son had not a single Bonapartist feature nor trait. He strongly resembled, however, a certain dashing Dutch admiral, one Flauhaut, on whom Hortense had been credited with bestowing a more than neighborly interest. It is not libelous, in view of many proven facts, indeed it is scarce gossip, to say that Hortense, like her mother the Empress Josephine, had had the foible of loving not wisely, but too often. In any event, whoever may have been his father, Louis Napoleon was kindly received by the Jumels, not as a prince, but as a guest of honor. And Papa Jumel lent him much hard-earned American money. Among all the Bonapartes, Louis was the least promising of the Jumels' beneficiaries, and of them all he alone was to make any return for their goodness to him. The Prince de Joinville, here to investigate and, if necessary, buy off Eleazer William's claim to be the lost Dauphin, stayed at the mansion and paid charming attentions to Betty. So did the polished old scoundrel Talleyrand, whom Napoleon had daintily described as a silk stocking filled with muck. Less lofty of birth, but worth all the Bonapartes put together in point of genius, was a young American poet who vastly admired Betty, and who, on her invitation, spent weeks at a time at the mansion. He was Fitz-Greene Halleck, and, seated on the porch of the Jumel house, he wrote a poem that 1,000,000 schoolboys were soon to spout, Marco Bozzaris. One morning in 1830, Papa Jumel set out for New York on a business call to his bankers. He rode forth from the long winding driveway, several flat houses and stores and streets cut across that driveway's course today, in the lumbering and costly family coach. An hour later he was brought home dying. The coach had upset on the frost-rutted road a few miles to the south. Jumel had fallen out on his head. Papa Jumel was in the late 70s at the time of his death. His widow was either 53 or 61, all depending on whether you believe her own statement or the homely Rhode Island facts. What does it matter? She was one of the superwomen who do not grow old. Scarce was her worthy spouse stretched comfortably in his last sleep when suitors thronged the house. And it was not alone because the widow Jumel was one of the richest women in America. She still held her ancient sway over men's hearts, still made sentimental mush of men's brains. Gossip, silenced of late years, sprang eagerly and happily to life. Once more did New York ring with Betty's daring flirtations. But she cared little for people's talk. She was rich enough, famous enough, clever enough, still beautiful enough to be a law unto herself. The very folk who gossiped so scandalously about her were most eager to catch her eye in public or to secure an invitation to the great mansion on the Harlem. As to men, she had never yet in all her 53, or was it 61, years met her match at heart-smashing. But she was to meet him, and soon. Will you let me go back for a space and sketch, in a mere mouthful of words, the haps and mishaps of one of Betty's earlier admirers? Aaron Burr was Vice President of the United States when he shot Hamilton. The bullet that killed Hamilton rebounded and killed Burr's political future, for Hamilton was a national favorite and Burr was not. Burr served out his term as vice president amid a whirlwind of national hatred. Then he went West, a bitterly disappointed and vengeful man, and embarked on an incredibly audacious scheme whereby he was to wrench free the great West and Southwest from the rest of the Union and install himself as emperor of that vast region under the title of Aaron I. The scheme failed, and Burr was hauled before the bar of justice on charges of high treason. Through some lucky fate or other he was acquitted, but he was secretly advised to leave America. He followed the advice. And when he wanted to come back to the United States, he found every port closed against him. So he starved for a time in obscure European lodging. His heart had been broken years earlier by the death of the only woman he ever truly loved. She was not one of the hundreds who made fools of themselves over him. She was not his wife, who had died so long before. She was his only daughter, Theodosia, the only holy influence in his tempestuous life. And Theodosia had been lost at sea. No authentic word of her or of the ship that carried her has ever been received. Burr had spent every day for months pacing the Battery sea wall, straining those uncanny black eyes of his for glimpses of her ship. He had spent every dollar he could lay hands on in sending for news of her. And then he had given up hope. This had been long before. His daughter dead, his political hopes blasted, his country's gates barred against him, he dragged out a miserable life in Europe. Then, after years of absence, he slipped into the United States in disguise. The first news of his return came in a New York newspaper announcement that Colonel Aaron Burr has opened law offices on the second floor of 23 Nassau Street. The government made no move to deport him. Clients by the dozen flocked to take advantage of his brilliant legal intellect. Poverty, in a breath, gave place to prosperity. This was in the spring of 1833, a scant 3 years after Papa Jumel's sudden demise. Tidings came to Betty that her old adorer, after so long a lapse of time, was back in New York. And across the gap of years came memories of his mesmeric eyes, his wonderful voice, the eyes and voice no woman could resist, the inspired manner of his love-making, and Betty went to him. Throughout his love-starred life, it was Burr's solemn declaration that never once did he take a single step out of his path to win any woman, that all his myriad conquests came to him unsought. Probably this was true. There are worse ways of bagging any form of game than by still hunting. Perhaps there are few better. At all events, down Broadway in her France-built coach rolled Betty Jumel, tall, blonde, statuesque as in the Betty Bowen days when Peter Croy had bought a book for his friends to read. She called on Burr, ostensibly to consult him about a legal matter involving a real estate deal. But Burr understood. Burr always understood. He saw, too, that Betty was still fair to look upon, and that she had lost little of her charm. By common report, he knew she was egregiously rich. He himself was wizened, white of hair, and 78 years old. Poverty, griefs, bitter disappointments had sadly broken him. Save for his eyes and voice and brain, there was little about him to remind Betty of the all-conquering and dapper little Lothario of 40 years back. Yet, as he listened and looked, she loved him. Yes, there is a goodly assortment of hornets' nests wherein a fool may run his head without visiting the same nest twice. A few days after her call at his office, Betty gave one of her renowned dinner parties. It was in honor of Colonel Burr. The guest of honor carried all before him that evening. The people who had come to stare at him as an escaped arch-criminal went home wholly enslaved by his magnetic charm. Aaron Burr had come to his own again. In saying good night to his hostess, Burr lingered after the other guests had trundled off cityward in their carriages. Then, taking his leave with bared head, there in the moonlight on the steps of the Jumel mansion, he dropped lightly to one knee and raised Betty's hand to his lips. "Madam," he breathed, the merciful moonlight making him for the moment his young and irresistible self again, "Madam, I give you my hand. My heart has long been yours." It was a pretty old-world speech. Betty thought, or affected to think, it meant nothing. But it was the opening gun of a swift campaign. Day after day thereafter, Burr neglected his fast-growing law business to drive out to the house above the river. Every day he drew the siege lines closer to the citadel. At length he asked Betty to marry him. With a final glimmer of common sense, she refused. He went away. Betty feared he would not come back, but he did. He came back the very next day, July 1, 1833, and with him in the carriage was another old man, the Reverend Dr. Bogart, who had performed the marriage ceremony for Burr and the latter's first wife. To the butler who admitted them, Burr gave a curt message for Madame Jumel, asking that she come down to them at once in the drawing-room. Wondering, she obeyed. "Madam," said Burr, by way of salutation, "I have come here today to marry you. Pray get ready at once." Betty indignantly refused, and all but ordered her suitor and the clergyman from the house. Then Burr began to talk. The consummate eloquence that had swayed prejudiced juries to his will, the love pleas that no woman had been able to hear unmoved, the matchless skill at argument that had made him master of men and women alike, all were brought into play. An aged, discredited, half-impoverished failure was asking a beautiful and enormously rich woman to be his wife. Those were the cold facts. But cold facts had a way of vanishing before Aaron Burr's personality. Perhaps the greatest lingual triumph of his 78 years was won when this feeble old man broke down within half an hour all Betty's defenses of coquetry and of sanity as well. At last she ran from the room, murmuring that she would decide and let him know. Burr sank back wearily in his chair. The victory was won. He knew it. A little later Betty reappeared at the head of the stairs. She was resplendent in a gown of thick, stiff, dove-colored satin, and she glittered with 1,000 jewels. Burr, lightly as a boy, ran up the stairs to meet her. Without a word she took his proffered arm. Together they walked to where the clergyman, stationed by Burr, awaited them. And they were married, Superwoman and Superman, I know of no other instance in the history of love where two such consummate heartbreakers became man and wife. It would be pleasant to record that the magnetic old couple walked hand in hand into the sunset, that their last years were spent together in the light of the afterglow. Here was a husband after Betty's own heart. Here was a wife to excite the envy of all Burr's friends, to rehabilitate him socially and financially. It seemed an ideal union. But the new wed pair did none of the things that any optimist would predict, that any astute student of human nature would set down in a novel about them. Before the honeymoon was over, they were quarreling like cat and dog. About money, of course. Burr sold some stock for his wife, and neglected to turn over the proceeds to her. She asked for the money. He curtly replied, "Madam, this time you are married to a man who will henceforth take charge of all your business affairs." Betty's temper had never, at best, threatened to rob the patient Griselda of her laurels. Men had been her slaves, not her masters. She had no fancy for changing the lifelong conditions. So, in a blaze of anger, she not only demanded her money, but hinted very strongly that Colonel Burr was little better than a common fortune hunter. Burr ordered her to go to her room and stay there until she could remember the respect due from a wife to her husband. She made a hot retort to the effect that the house was hers, and that but for her wealth Burr was a mere outcast and beggar. Burr, without a word, turned and left the house. This was just 10 days after the wedding. He went to New York and took up his abode in his former Duane Street lodgings. Betty, scared and penitent, went after him. There was a reconciliation, and he came back. But soon there was another squabble about money, and Betty, in another tantrum, went to a lawyer and brought suit to take the control of her fortune out of her husband's hands. Again Burr left his new home, vowing he would never return. The poor old fellow, once more cast upon his own resources, and self-deprived of the luxuries his wife's money had brought him, fell ill. When Betty, in another contrite fit, went to plead with him to come back, she found him delirious. She had him carried out to the mansion, and for weeks nursed him right tenderly. But when he came again to his senses, Burr would not speak to his wife. The moment he was able to get out of bed, he left the house. Betty never saw him again. Not very long afterward he died, in a Staten Island hotel, alone, unmourned, he who had been the darling of women. Did Betty mourn her husband emeritus? Not noticeably. She was not of the type that mourns. Before Burr was fairly under the sod, she was flirting gaily, and was demanding and receiving the same admiration that had always been hers. She sought to make people forget that she had ever been Mrs. Burr, and she asked them to call her once more Madame Jumel. She dazzled New York with a mammoth flower fete in the summer of 1837, and once more, heedless of people's opinions, ruled as queen of New York's little social realm. And so the years sped on, until the Superwoman of other days could no longer fight off that incurable disease, old age. American men no longer vied for her favors. She decided that American men's taste for beauty had been swallowed up by commercialism, and she went again to Paris, where she remembered men had never ceased to sue for her love. This was in 1853. Louis Napoleon had just made himself Napoleon III, Emperor of the French. He had a way, in the days of his power, of forgetting those who had befriended him when he was down-at-the-heel exile, and of snubbing former friends who were so foolish as to claim present notice on the ground of past favors. But he made a notable exception in the case of Madame Jumel. He received her with open arms, gave a court ball in honor of her return to Paris, and in every way treated her almost as if she had been a visiting sovereign. One likes to think his overworked recording angel put all this down in large letters on the credit side of Napoleon the Little's celestial ledger page. Heaven knows there was plenty of blank space on that side of the page for any such entries. But on Betty herself the effect of all this adoration was decidedly startling. Treated like a queen, she grew to believe she was a queen. The razor-keen wits that had stood by her so gallantly for 3/4 of a century or more were dulling. Her mind began wandering helplessly in the realms of fancy. An odd phase of her mental decay was that she took to babbling incessantly of Aaron Burr, whose name she had not spoken in years, and she seemed to forget that she had ever met a man named Jumel. She came back to the old house on the hill overlooking the Harlem. The stream was no longer as pastoral and deserted as in earlier days, and houses and cottages had begun to spring up all around the confines of the mansion's grounds. New York was slowly creeping northward. But it is to be doubted that Betty realized the change. She was a queen, no less a queen because she ruled an imaginary kingdom. She declared that her position as a sovereign demanded a body of household troops, so she hired a bodyguard of 20 soldiers, dressed them in gay uniforms, and placed them on duty around the house. She increased her staff of servants to an amazing degree. She assumed regal airs. Every visitor was announced as if entering the presence of royalty. Betty no longer received callers. Instead, she held audiences. Yearly she journeyed in state to Saratoga, with a retinue of 50 servants and officers of the household. Money went like water in the upkeep of the queenly establishment. The once boundless Jumel wealth that she had helped to amass began to shrink under the strain. Yet so great was that fortune that more than $1 million of it was left after she died. New York was kind. Men who had loved Betty, women who had been envied because of her friendship for them, rallied about her now in her dotage and helped her keep up the pitiable farce of queenship. And in the mansion on the hill, on July 16, 1865, she fell asleep. A score of New York's foremost men were her honorary pallbearers, and all society made for the last time the long journey to Harlem to honor her memory. So died Betty Bowen, Betty Jumel, Betty Burr, whatever you prefer to call her. She was New York's first and greatest official heartbreaker. She was doubly fortunate, too, in missing the average old superwoman's realization of having outgrown her wonder charm. For when her life book of beauty and power and magnetism closed, delusion tenderly took up the tale, and through a fairyland of imagined admiration and regal rank, Betty tottered happily to the very end. End of chapter 5. Recording by Linda Johnson.